I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Good morning, Dr. Hughes.
Good morning.
How you doing? Happy New Year.
Yes, it wasn't that happy a new year after a couple days. The inauguration of Mamdani started it off well, but then everything started to go to heck after
just
that.
New Year.
Yeah, now it's just New Year. Yeah.
Well, if it's any consolation, this might all be a simulation and, we could reboot, which is what we're talking about today.
And that is the enduring appeal of this idea that we're going to be talking about, that maybe this is all just a dream.
Yep. So from Descartes on, the big dream question. So the simulation hypothesis, do you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the argument?
Yes, please. So what we're talking about is the idea that this isn't the base level of reality, that we may or may not have realer bodies someplace in a realer world than this one. This is the world that we're just kind of existing in as a dream. We may be just dreams ourselves, or we may have real bodies out there. So that's part of the history of people trying to figure that out. And I think it's distinct also from the idea of solipsistic idealism, that nothing exists except that we're the only real thing in the world and that we're just creating the universe. I mean, there's obviously a connection to there. But the idea of the simulation hypothesis is more that there is a dream world and that we're stuck in it somehow and we don't know how to get out yet. And we may or may not be realer someplace else once we get out.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about that idea in the history of thought, there's certainly Eastern religious metaphors that are very close to that the world is an illusion and that we're creating this illusion through karma or through, and that once we liberate ourselves through liberatory practices, we will see a realer world. But I think most of those views don't believe that this is a designed world. It wasn't like it's not an engineer that created it. It's more either a function of the universe or, in fact, solipsistic idealism that we're kind of creating our own reality. And so the idea that we're living in a designed universe has more resonance, I think, in Hinduism, you could say that some of the ideas about the radical idealism are theistic in that respect, the universe is designed, but not in Buddhist idealism, which has its own versions of idealism. But in Western thought, of course, we can talk about Plato's cave, the notion that the reality that we see are just the shadows on the cave wall, and that there are levels of waking up from reality until you're finally outside and you truly see what's really real in the world. There's ideas of Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, the idea that some battle between the gods created this false world that we have to live in, and that once we wake up from this falseness of flesh, we will be free in the new world of spirit. And so that those kinds of neo-Gnostic ideas. And that leads us up to Burley, who's the most well-known Western philosophical touchpoint for the idea that we're just kind of living in the mind of God. Bishop Burley, 400 years ago, believed that the world was only stable because God was always looking at it, which is kind of interesting because it's kind of like the quantum stuff we'll talk about in a second. But and that the only reason that the world is orderly is that God wants to present to us a theater of orderliness for his own purposes. And so that's really, I think, where you get to the closest resonance to the idea of, into the intelligent design of the universe, that we're living in a simulated universe. And then there's that question, well, if this is the only place we live, and there is no other universe, if we're just living in a dream, is it any different from what we thought in the first place, that we were just living in reality, right? If reality is a dream?
Yep. And so with that history, we reach the 21st century, about 2003, and Nick Bostrom at Oxford writes a paper on the simulation hypothesis, and the argument of that paper has turned out to be the most influential version of the argument in recent times. And the claim is essentially that there's a non-trivial chance that we are in what he calls an ancestor simulation. So he says something like, if I'm remembering correctly, there's three possibilities, right? Either societies destroy themselves before they reach a technological level in which they can replicate and simulate their cultural life. That's one possibility. The other possibility is societies reach the level in which they can come up with something like, a flight simulator, but for all of history and culture, but they just don't give a shit. They're not interested. They don't want to do it. And the third possibility is that societies reach the ability to create this sort of very involved simulation / virtual reality. They do think it's interesting and cool to do it. And in fact, under those circumstances, it's more likely than not that we are part of some such simulation of an older society or civilization. Something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's useful just to note that Nick's PhD thesis was on the anthropic principle, the anthropic bias in epistemology. And so he was basically saying, given that we can only exist in the kind of universe that we exist in, that we can exist in, what does that tell us about the universe that we observe, right? So, like, if there were multiple universes and there's only some that we could exist in and could be observed, does that tell you about the nature, the distribution of other universes? So that was his initial dissertation kind of question. And applying that to this question of simulation, he was saying, if we imagine that there's, the universe has trillions and trillions and trillions of habitable stars and that there's trillions of years to do experiments in and for civilizations to grow, and that some of those civilizations, just a tiny fraction has to do it, but just as some of those civilizations do simulations that are so realistic that the creatures, the intelligent creatures inside of them do not know that they're in a simulation, then the likelihood that you as a particular person exist in the real world is a statistical question about how many people exist in the real world versus how many people exist in these simulations. And his conclusion was that statistically, you could make the case that it's more likely that you're in a simulation than you're not. Now, there's many, many ways to tear apart that argument, but it's a pretty popular speculation, I would say. And it relates to pop culture ideas like The Matrix, that there could be such a simulation that we would be living in and that we wouldn't be able to tell. And so there's, a very popular phrase among people who are familiar with that's a glitch in the Matrix. It's like looking for evidence that we might be, in fact, in a video game and not know it. We might be NPCs in a video game.
And I think that so again, just to sort of underscore the possibility, it is possible that we are characters in a simulation, a very good simulation, created by an advanced society that was interested in running simulations, or maybe a very advanced version of ourselves, which was interested in running simulations about how the other societies live or how that society used to live historically.
Yeah, the idea that it's an ancestor simulation is popular for some reason. I've never really understood that. It's like if you're running a simulation like SimCity, it's like the fact that we happen to be bipedal hominids who speak English or whatever. That could just be an accident, a random accident of the simulation. It could be something entirely different that created
the argument is consistent with there being many simulations. So.
Right.
In parallel.
Exactly.
So that would be the sort of simulation version of parallel universes thinking.
It would be a nice explanation for the Fermi paradox, by the way.
Yeah.
It's why we don't see others, because they were kind of isolated in our little bubble here.
Yeah. I liked Avi Loeb's explanation more, namely we don't see others because we're not looking where we should be looking, or we're not looking aggressively enough and we're waiting for them to come to us.
Which is part of the question here is like, how would we detect if we were in a simulation?
Yeah. I think part of what sort of, as you started us off very nicely, versions and varieties of this, resonate through the history of both Western and non-Western thought. I think part of what recenters this in recent years is the acceleration in the development of AI and the acceleration in the development of video games. And in some way, it's just easier to imagine, So if you think about something like take a popular video game like, Grand Theft Auto or something like that, and think of how aggressively and remarkably it's developed in the last however long it exists, 20 years or something like that. The current versions are so much more realistic, as it were, right, than the old ones. And we are increasingly moving in video games into a time when non-playable characters, NPCs, so the sort of characters that are in the background, they could be powered by large language models. And as a result, you could interact with them. And so I think these developments are giving you a sense of what it might be like to be in a simulation. We're not there yet, obviously. There's a whole bunch of things that we can't simulate yet in virtual reality, but we're a lot closer than we used to be.
I agree. I think technologically, it's gotten a lot easier. I mean, I think the speculations when Bostrom wrote this, we didn't have Gen AI. So the speculations are really, is this ever going to be possible? The matrix level of simulation. And that really doesn't require artificial intelligence. But in terms of having consciousnesses in a simulated reality that don't know that they're in a simulated reality, we used to talk about like the brain in the vat experiment. That's a version of a radical idealism that you could, in fact, be a brain in a vat, and all the external sense stimuli are being fed to you are fake. And that's also like Descartes' meditation on the demon. That what if we were truly being tormented by a demon who had control over all of our senses, we would have no way of detecting epistemologically whether we were in fact real or not, right? And I think that is the enduring problem here, is that a truly determined engineer of our simulated reality, and this is how it connects also to political and sociological reasons why people might be suspicious in this way. But if you're the subject of a truly determined, omniscient and omnipresent being who wants to control every aspect of your reality so you never know that you're in a simulation, you would never be able to tell, right? So it gives warrant to a great deal of paranoia.
Right. In your reading, what are the best arguments against at least Bostrom's version of the simulation hypothesis?
Well, I think one argument is about what does it mean to be for the statistics of this to work? Is it that it makes a lot of assumptions about the nature of the worlds that get created. So if it was, in fact, that the experiment does not have to simulate an entire world, it just has to simulate the experience of one being, right? That gets back to the kind of Truman Show. You are the experimental subject here. You are the rat in the maze. And if that's all the experiment is, and of course, in the history of religious thought, Berkeley would have said, yeah, every evidence that there are other people or that there's prehistory, that there were dinosaurs, anything like that, that's just put there by God in order to test you or whatever, right? So if that's all the simulation is, then statistically, it makes a lot more sense to say that there are many more sentient beings in the real universe than there are in this bubble that you happen to exist in. So why are you assuming that there's an entire universe of sentient beings created by this experiment? Yes, you can observe other star systems and you have made assumptions that there are other sentient beings out there, but we've never met any of them, and you're the only person you really know about. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that kind of problem statistically with it. But I think the other end of the problem is that it really doesn't make any difference, because if you get to contemporary physics ideas about the nature of the universe, ideas like the idea that the whole universe is a product of computation, that at the base level of reality, there's no distinction between what we're saying happens quantumly and what we're saying happens computationally, that there's some kind of calculations going on, and that in that regard, whether or not there was a creator, we are living in a simulated reality of some kind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, philosophically, in some way, I think that is the most interesting question, namely the sort of who cares question. Like, why does it matter to me? Assume Bostrom is right and we are NPCs in a large video game. Why should it matter to me? I mean, you could see that if you spend too much time, thinking about this, it could be for some kind of personalities psychologically destabilizing. But apart from the sort of extremely neurotic or pathological end of the scale, why should I care if it's a simulation or not?
Well, let's say, why do people historically seem to have cared? And what are the things that seem to drive this? And the most famous sociological explanation for this kind of Gnostic idea is Hans Jonas's The Gnostic Religion. And he argued that the Gnostic movements of the 22nd century AD were a direct response to the breakdown of the Greek, Roman polis, the rise of the Roman Empire, this, what he called cosmic homelessness that people felt. And I think that there's a general sociological belief that the breakdown of, in rapid social change, we see the breakdown of people's traditional beliefs about the world. And especially if they think that there are hidden rules that they don't have access to, that they've been disempowered, that there are hidden elites and things like that, they're going to be more prone to the idea that this is all a dream kind of promise. And so there could be that kind of sociological connection here, that these religious ideas or philosophical ideas become more popular in times of rapid social change, which we're certainly currently in. But the people who have taken it seriously, taken Bostrom's idea seriously, I remember going to a meeting at Oxford back in 2006, and part of the discussion was the mitigation. How do we rank all the different existential risks that humanity faces, and how do we think about mitigating the risks? And Bostrom wanted to have on the list the risk that the simulation gets turned off, that all of our existences get winked out by the simulator. And in fact, Ian Banks is a science fiction author. He wrote a novel in which there's a religion that is trying to convince the entire sentient galaxy that we're in a simulation, because once a majority of sentient beings believe that, they'll turn off the simulation and we can get to the next level.
That's really funny to me that that's where Bostrom went. And in a way, so much of this is about a sort of science fiction-y kind of sensibility, because you could say, one anxiety that you would have if you thought that you were living in a simulation was that you were worried that the simulation gets turned off. The other sort of more humdrum anxiety that you would have is that phenomenologically, people who think that they're living in a simulation might not care as much as people committed to a more sort of traditional version of reality about the morality of their action. They might say, well, if I didn't get up for an old lady in the bus, or if I was an asshole to my girlfriend, it's just an NPC acting in a video game. It's not the end of the world. The stakes are lower. And that's a different order of concern.
Well, yes. And that kind of hinges on, okay, you're living in a simulation. What was the intent of the simulator? And how do you relate to that, right? If you believe in, I think the vast majority of people who believe that they live in a simulated universe would believe that there was a benign or, divine intent to the creation of this universe. That's what most religious people believe.
Yeah, so let's just pause there and make that point that you're just making explicit. So the first answer to the question, why does it matter if we are living in a simulator, is in a simulation, is religion. If we are living in a simulation, then there's a simulator, there's a creator of the simulation. And in fact, some of the responses from very serious quarters to Bostrom's argument in the early 2000s were, I think I even saw a quote about this is one of the most serious arguments for the existence of God, or for the possibility of the existence of God in centuries.
The existence of a God.
A God.
Right?
Right.
There's lots of different kinds of gods. And I think there's no... in the first place, the intent of the creator, if we're living in a simulation, could be completely unknowable to us and ununderstandable to us. It could be beyond our comprehension.
Yeah.
But even if we understood it, it could be that their intent had nothing to do with us, that we're completely insignificant in the larger purpose of the simulation, that we're just dust in the wheels.
Right.
Or that they had malign intent, right? That it's a simulation to try to figure out how much a person can take,
Yep.
So there's nothing baked into Bostrom's speculation about the intent.
Descartes' evil demon upgraded.
Right.
Yeah.
Could be evil demon upgraded.
Yeah.
As I've said before, the Mormon transhumanists interpret this to say, well, there are arguments for why more intelligent beings would have to be nicer beings, and one is that they would kill themselves, which gets back to Bostrom's speculation. Post-human civilizations may, in fact, 99.9% of them may wink out by killing themselves with doing dumb things. And so the ones that survive, what can we assume about the ones that might survive? And one thing that you could assume, I don't, but I think that you could assume is that they're going to be nice, whatever that means. And so if they're going to be nice, then the creator of our simulation was probably nice, and whatever that means for us. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. The niceness of God and their divine inscrutable purposes does not seem to have done very much for the human condition. So.
Yeah, but be that as it may, whatever the version of a God that is implied, accepting the simulation hypothesis is an argument against materialism, if I understand it correctly, right?
Yeah. Well, that gets back to this, the horseshoe theory of materialism and idealism is that interpreting the physical laws of the universe, it may be that this is all a computation anyway, that is the fundamental material nature of the reality. So
crude materialism, namely, there's nothing more to the world than what you can experience. And
right.
The simulation hypothesis suggests that there is more to the world than you can experience because you can't experience what's outside of the simulation, but that's the real. I
mean, the fundamental Buddhist logician move is to always say A is not, it's not A, it's not B, it's not A and B, it's not A nor B. It's okay. So in this particular case, I'm comfortable with the notion that there could be a convergent point where the question of whether this is real or a dream is pointless. Mm-hmm. Truly, there is no distinction between being real and a dream. That would be the convergent point.
Let me rejigger the question then. Beyond the sort of stoner pastime of watching The Matrix when you're high, I think there's a real sort of disjunction here about whether the simulation hypothesis is just an anti-materialist metaphor in some way that gets upgraded whatever the technology is. In the beginning of the 20th century, some Buddhist scholars used the metaphor of movies to talk about the same thing, namely that, our life was like the events that would happen in a movie. The characters might, do X or Y, but the actors have a different reality than the characters. And now it's being upgraded to virtual reality and video games using AI. So it might be that it's just like we always use technological metaphors to describe and understand ourselves with the most advanced technology that we have, and that's, in some ways the history of technology. It's just a metaphorical description of a religious sensibility, whatever the religion may be. That's one possibility. The other possibility, though, which I think the more ambitious people who talk about this is that this is actually the best theory to account for a bunch of anomalies in our experience. Those anomalies including, psychedelic experiences where people, experience often a benign, sometimes a not benign break from the individualized nature of our everyday reality. Near-death experiences where people experience a version of the same without psychedelics, UAPs that we talked about and different. So another version of the argument is this is simply the best theory to account for a bunch of phenomena.
Yeah, I don't follow that.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any necessary connection between a belief in supernatural phenomena and a belief in the simulation. In other words, if the supernatural is just nature that we don't understand yet, then it could all be part of one consistent base reality. Mm-hmm. We don't have the rules for describing it yet. So yes, if we were living in a world of a dream, as we understand, dream worlds can be much more flexible and can break rules, physical rules, in ways that base reality does not appear to do. And so I understand why, that would make it more plausible that you would have ghosts or psychic phenomena.
Well,
or whatever.
but if I'm Bostrom, I'm going to say, well, if people can break out of the simulation and understand the epistemology of what's outside of it, what's the point of having a simulation? And then you do really get the risk of shutting down the simulation. So,
well, you get some interesting theological ideas. I mean, Mark Walker has written his thesis 25 years ago now on the idea of Arianism. I know I can never say it right. It's not Aryan like Germans, but there's an ancient religious dogma of the early Christians, like second century Christians, that we are children of God and that we're meant to grow up, and that part of growing up is becoming godlike in our comprehension of the nature of reality, and that it's a warrant for kind of posthumanism, Christian posthumanism, basically. And I think you can make that argument for Hinduism and Buddhism, that they both imagine that a stage of our evolution would be becoming godlike. So, the idea that the point of the simulation is, in fact, for us to graduate. Mm-hmm. That I don't think that that's contradictory to the history of thought.
Why, though? Like, why?
Why would we have to graduate?
Why would you care?
You think we're done? You think this is God's intent, the way that we are now?
No, I just don't get why a simulator would make a simulation in which the characters have to graduate what they would graduate into, what the point would be. Then it starts becoming kind of like, what's the purpose of doing that?
Well, I reject the idea because of its incredible arrogance and egocentricity, the assumption that we, our individual consciousnesses or as a species, would have anything to do with the intent of a creator that created trillions and trillions and trillions of other planets out there. So, if the intent of the creator was to create a universe that at 1 trillion years old doesn't dissipate into the heat death of the universe, I don't think we as a species really have very much to contribute to that.
Yeah. What about Occam's razor, which would just say it's very possible that we don't understand all the physical laws of the universe, and we just need to work harder to understand them, and you don't need any fancy, silly simulation hypotheses. You just need to work harder to understand the physical rules of the universe.
Well, again, if you believe that observers collapse quantum states into observable reality, you begin through fundamental physics to get to this question of, well, what's the real difference here between we're living in a dream? But I think that's the world I prefer to live in, the assumption that we're living in a base reality. And because I've come to the conclusion that it may not make any difference. So I think there are ways to imagine positive and negative outcomes of believing in this. One is Robin Hanson argued that, he's an economist at George Mason, he argued that if we're living in a simulation, that presumably they want to be entertained, the creators of the simulation, so that you should be as entertaining as you possibly can be, which I think is an interesting way to approach life, But for the vast majority of people, believing that they live in a simulation is a matter of having a God eye in the sky that is watching you masturbate or whatever, and so that you need to keep your nose clean. And I understand why that idea has been useful and popular throughout history as well.
Yeah.
So I'm perfectly content to live in a base reality, and I think that it's consistent with what we know about physics.
Yeah. There's two sort of concerns that you can raise about it. One you just raised, which is you could easily see how this would sort of become cover for religious or political surveillance of one kind or another. There's the Humean point, and in the Jewish tradition, Kabbalah has, the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah has some sort of related warnings about this. But I like Hume's version very much, which in which he argues there's also, some of the weird sort of Buddhist inflected questions that he has about personal identity or about the nature of causation. He says you can only think about this too much before you drive yourself crazy. Keep your metaphysics human, even in the midst of thinking really weird thoughts. And after you think them for a while, go out with your friends to the pub and play billiards, because otherwise you're going to fuck yourself in the head. I've always found that to be very attractive. And to be honest, That's my beef with simulation hypothesis. As I was preparing for our conversation, I, read quite a bit about this, reread the Bostrom article, read quite a bit about this, listened to a few podcasts about it. Then I felt after about 2 hours I was going gloopy. I can't play billiard for shit, but I went to watch some TV or walk the dog, That's my worry about the simulation hypothesis. Nothing good comes of this.
Well, I agree. There's definitely a risk, and Buddhist psychology, Buddhist meditation teachers have often known that there are these risks, that certain kinds of intense meditation could lead people to go off the deep end. And, in Tantra, it's called the right-hand path, the danger of the right-hand path. But in psychedelic research, you see the same thing. People who begin to lose the grasp, even with abuse of cannabis, we see this. People high so much that they begin to question the nature of reality and have psychiatric problems. So, I think there's definitely a risk of this. Is it the fault of philosophers who speculate about idealism that there's a psychological state that could be dangerous?
That's a great question. So let me provocatively say, yes, it is. The fetishizing of ultimate reality is problematic. That's sort of...
The fetishizing of... I thought we were going in the opposite direction. I thought you were saying that the belief in a simulated universe was the danger here, but you're saying, no, fetishizing reality is the...
No, I'm saying if you are living in the Matrix and having a happy family life and your kids like you and you get along with your friends, and then you start with all this bullshit about whatever the truth pill color
see,
is.
the Neo-Straussian comes out. It doesn't make any difference.
Just stay in the fucking simulation.
As long as you stay in the simulation and do what you're fucking told,
exactly.
I don't care what you believe.
Exactly. Just be a good dad, be a good friend, and, stop fucking around.
Well, I may agree that I don't care, but it's not because I want people to stay in the Matrix. In fact, I think
there is no Matrix. The questions are useless. These are like nerdy sci-fi questions.
As a Buddhist, I do believe that we have control over how the reality that we perceive. I believe that there is actually a reality out there you're going to stub your toe on, but I believe you do have a lot of control over how you perceive that reality, and that you can liberate yourself from the egocentric views, for instance, of your reality. And so I do believe in that kind of liberation from a false reality as a goal of an emancipatory goal.
You just get to the next level of false reality, right? In that metaphysic.
Well, in fact, yes. Buddhists say yes.
So why not stay in the first one if it's not terrible?
Well, no, but because you get freer and happier as you go up, and you cause other people less misery, which is a side benefit.
Sure. So I'd say just then stay in the one in which you started causing people less misery, rather than be obsessed with the question of ultimate reality. But you're not really. You're not obsessed with the question of ultimate reality, I think.
Well, the Buddhists believe that ultimate reality is shunyata, or emptiness, and so there is no ultimate reality. And yes, have you ever seen the 10 ox-herding pictures of Zen? Starts with a kid walking a bull, and eventually he harnesses the bull and he rides the bull, he masters the bull, that's the mind. Then there's an empty picture, and then there's a mountain, and then he walks back into town. And so the whole point of it is achieving enlightenment, realizing the nature of reality, brings you right back to where you were in the first place. You're still in reality. Right?
Yeah.
You just have a different perspective on the reality that you're in. That was the point of the Matrix. That's why so many books and movies, spun off of the Matrix, is that when they're given the choice, would you rather stay in the Matrix and eat steak or have this hard reality? That is, I think we do want to realize what base reality is, that it provides the bracing perspective. But in the end, the choice that Neo makes in the movie is that there is no fundamental difference, and the Matrix should go on. He is the restart button of the Matrix.
That choice, it's good that we get to the Matrix, because we were going to talk a little bit about the sort of cultural resonances of this idea, but that choice is a sort of false dichotomy in some way. It's not to continue to sort of have fun and games in the Matrix and eat steak or sort of walk towards the light I think the more layered description of the choice is, do you focus on the particular relationships that you had in the Matrix and to your richly textured life, or do you have the sort of philosophical attraction to abstraction? And that's a bigger philosophical question. Abstraction, principle, does have a kind of inherent tension with particularity, and does have costs in terms of particularity, right?
But why do you assume that the script that was written for you in Westworld? You're a robot, you're stuck in Westworld, you don't know that you're stuck in Westworld, you keep playing out the same script. Oh, you have richly textured relationships with other people, but it's all this scripted bullshit that was written by somebody else. Mm-hmm. And why do you assume that is what needs to be preserved for its meaning, rather than breaking out of that and trying to see what's outside?
Because anything else denies and defines and defies my powerful moral intuition that I would be causing harm to people and institutions that I love and care about in breaking out. That would be my concern. You know, I mean, again, this is one of the oldest questions in political philosophy. We celebrate heroes that sort of pursue abstract truth with a capital T. That pursuit always comes at the expense of particular connections with a small p and a small c. And, you know, Socrates is such a big hero because, you know, he, in the Apology, says, I'd rather die 1,000 times than live a shameful life. And, his friends in the Apology are going to bail him out and say, let's pay some money and, stay and we continue to shoot the shit, or, go into exile with your family. And he's like the New Hampshire license plate, right? Live free or die, fuck off. Of course not. And I was always like, dude, you have a wife, you have a kid. I know for the ancient Greeks, the home was very different status than it is for us, but the choice is not so obvious, right? So all of these pursuits of larger truth with a capital T come at the expense of particular connections. If they're fake, I don't give a shit, to be honest, if they have a real sort of purchase on my moral intuitions.
Well, I agree with your concern about the psychiatric complications that can arise and the misanthropy that can arise. I guess I'm even more concerned about the ways that it can lead to political quietism, or, right. It can be soma for our popular age. And in that regard, I think of Stanislaw Lem, who lived under Polish communism and wrote a lot of allegories that can be interpreted politically. And one was the Futurological Congress, written in 1968, I think. It starts with a guy getting gassed by a psychedelic crowd control drug and waking up 200 years later, as we're wont to do. And in that future world, everybody's high all the time. And the only drug that's banned is the drug that removes all drugs. And eventually he takes that drug, the drug that removes the effects of all other drugs, and he realizes that everyone's just walking around pretending to drive cars. They're just walking in the street, but they think they're driving cars. They're eating cardboard slop out of a long trough, and they think they're in a fine restaurant. And the metaphor here is that the belief that the simulation that we're in is the political simulation. And I think that can be a liberatory message. It can also be a quietistic message. It can lead to a lot of conspiracy theory and a lot of fake political analysis that, nothing's real in the political world because actually the Jews control everything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, the QAnon people would have a party with, simulation hypothesis, right? Like the reality that we see has nothing to do with the actual reality. There's a cabal of lizard people,
Right. I mean, I don't think that we can ever have a truly consensual, objective reality. I think that's always a political contested category. But I do think that it is a goal. And, it is you believe in the utility of chains. I believe in the utility of some shared illusions like world law, human rights, and objective reality.
Well, sir, my chains are metaphorical, so we're not that far apart. It's an interesting there's an interesting tension here that on the one hand, there is a pretty impressive philosophical, religious tradition of articulating the simulation hypothesis, and there's pretty impressive contemporary philosophical versions of it by Bostrom and others on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cultural resonance of this is completely kooky. It's conspiratorial. It's in stuff like The Matrix, which is a popular movie, but then sort of
Truman Show.
But then in terms of the discussion groups, it goes towards this is the explanation for UFOs and near-death experiences and so on and so forth. So it's a weird divergence there between the seriousness of the tradition of thinking about this and the cultural resonance.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't think that there's any necessary supernatural implications of the simulation hypothesis or vice versa, but I'd certainly understand why people who suspect that there's a base reality and that we're living in something else would have supernaturalist inclinations. I think there's also the political and sociological resonances that, the more insecurity people have and the more suspicion, the more powerlessness they feel over reality, the more they would be attracted to these ideas. But, how resonant is it? I don't know. I mean, there aren't that many religious sects that advocate this kind of radical idealism. Even Buddhists aren't walking around saying, I can walk in front of a truck because it's not real or anything. I don't think that there's that much sociological resonance for it as we imagine, but we certainly see it popping up a lot in popular culture. There's the idea, I think the seamlessness, and it gets back to what we did with the multiverse, or the work that we did on virtual reality. And one of the things that we were pointing to a couple of years ago when we wrote that was that we may get to a point where the seamlessness of virtual reality and augmented daily reality becomes difficult to distinguish, right? And I think that is seeping into popular culture. There's, in fact, this TV show, now third season, just finished, Upload, about a world in which instead of dying, you just upload your consciousness into a virtual reality, and it has all these different corporate perks and settings and things like that if you have enough money. And then ordinary human people out in the outside world interact with you as if you're real. And they can put on suits and join you in the virtual reality and so forth. So this kind of, the seamlessness of that kind of virtuality and ordinary life, I think, has entered popular culture consciousness very, very profoundly.
Yeah, and not to mention that people spend... I think the openness to this idea, actually, if I was to offer predictions, is only going to increase because people already spend a large part of their time in virtual worlds. They're primitive virtual worlds, but think about how many of our social relationships and of our political protests and of our shopping and of our leisure happens on screens, happens on increasingly large screens, happens with, better and better VR goggles. So that's got to sort of push towards an openness for the reality of simulations because we spend more and more time in them. And then,
with this murder of Good, the woman murdered in Minnesota, it would not have had the same impact. There had already been 7 or 8 people killed by ICE in the last year, but it would not have had the same resonance if it had not been filmed from 20 different angles by everyone in that crowd.
Right.
So that is a great example of surveillance, of bottom-up surveillance that I hope will have put checks on power.
Yeah.
And of course, then immediately what happened was that people started using AI to manipulate the images coming from the scene on both sides.
Right.
And so we immediately had the fog of war about what the reality of that observed situation was.
Right. So you combine, so that's a great point, because then you combine the actual tendency of people to live in virtual spaces anyway with increasing skepticism about reality, which, has been discussed ad nauseum, so we don't have to say much about that. And then add to that what's likely to be the next stage of virtual reality, which is increased hepatic feedback. So, like the sort of the ability to feel in virtual
haptic. Hepatic feedback would be if your liver was involved.
Oh, sorry,
but,
haptic. Sorry,
haptic.
I'm trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but instead I'm intimating liver disease. All right. And then,
by the way, in the moral enhancement episode, I think I attributed to naloxone properties that it does not possess. So I will come back with it.
So naloxone causes liver disease. would be our combined ignorance. All right, we'll have to ask Jake to use virtual reality to make us sound a little smarter than we actually are.
That's right.
And then we're not anywhere near there yet, but the ability to virtually simulate emotions. So that, but the visuals of virtual reality are incredible, increasingly. And so I guess this little
smell.
Yeah, smell.
If you think on virtual reality, take a deep sniff.
By the way, I think that's been done for decades already.
Smell-o-vision?
Yeah, I think there's been versions of it.
There definitely are smell-o-visions.
Yeah. All of which is to say, that's a landscape in which people are going to become more open to the idea of the simulation hypothesis or a simulation hypothesis.
Right, exactly.
Well,
and I do worry about that epistemologically. But again, I think there is a Buddhist answer here, which is don't worry about that. It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. But is that Buddhist answer sort of, does it amount to a sort of endless climb out of the simulation into the next level of the simulation? It's like a game of levels that doesn't end?
I mean, I think the pastoral point, if someone comes to you and says, brother, what should I do? I think I'm living in a simulation, that you say what you said.
Read Burke.
And what I would say. Or Burke, is be a nice person. Figure out what you want to accomplish with your life and dedicate yourself to that. And it probably doesn't make any difference if we're living in a simulation or not. The point is to live your life.
I guess the divergence between us is that I have a suspicion that talking too much about whether the world is a simulation or not gets in the way of being a nice person.
Well, as I've already pointed out, Nir, sociologically, when people believe that they are being observed, they tend to be nicer people, or at least more morally conscientious people.
I see. So that's the key to how charming you are.
That's right. I believe that the overmind is eventually going to judge me and weigh my talents and decide whether I need to go to hell or not.
Well, I'm happy that you're still okay hanging out with me then.
I don't think you've been too much of a decrement on my karmic burden.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to tell our listeners that for about a year now, we've had a segment on the news in the show, and it's been fun. But since we sometimes post the episodes after we record them, the news that we discuss can become outdated. And so we thought we would actually replace our news overview segment with pop culture / movies recommendation segment.
What Nir is saying is the reality is too depressing, so we're just going to start talking about fiction from now on.
Exactly.
It's the kind of fitting coda to the discussion we just had.
Exactly. Nir is promoting escapism without wondering about the ultimate nature of reality. So maybe I'll kick us off with an author that Professor Hughes and I both love, which is the science fiction author Ted Chiang. And I think the reason why we both like him a lot is that he is what you might call, and what we did call one time when we wrote a paper about him together, a techno-realist, somebody who is nestled comfortably between being a Luddite and a booster and an optimist. And the recommendation that I would like to put on the table is a long short story or a novella called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling by Chiang. And it tells two parallel stories, one in which people get a sort of retinal implant in which their memory is enhanced by the ability to search video and photographic records of everything they've seen, and another in a tribal society in which writing is just introduced, and the way in which it changes the sort of social structures and institutions of that society. And in both cases, you get this kind of sense of how a new technology destroys the traditions and ways of life on the one hand, or assumptions, but that sometimes those assumptions also sucked, and the improvement can be useful. So, like with the recording devices, you get, for example, this example in which couples who fight with each other can sort of litigate their fights about who said what to who with great empirical precision, and that seems like a really bad idea on the one hand. But on the other hand, there's this sort of broken relationship between a dad and his daughter, and the dad kind of thinks he's very noble and forgiving because he was willing to let go and forgive something terribly shitty that the daughter had said in the past. And when the technology is introduced, it turns out that actually he was the one who said the shitty thing, and he kind of created a much more self-flattering version of history for himself than he should have.
Yeah. No, we've written about Chang before, and of course, he's a very well-respected science fiction author as well, but often on the top of the lists of philosophical science fiction that, warrants a good deep read.
Yeah. So in our next meeting, it'll be Jay's turn to indoctrinate you with his technical optimistic preferences. But yeah, I think we can sign off for today, Dr. Hughes.
Excellent. Very nice talking to you, sir.
Good to talk to you too.